On April 18, 2014, 16 Sherpas died in the Khumbu icefall. They were not clients. They were load carriers, moving equipment to higher camps before the paying teams had even left base camp. By that point, the season had already generated millions for Nepal's economy. The government's response came within days. An Everest permit costs $11,000. The compensation offered for each of those 16 lives was only about $410. When the Sherpas still on the mountain learned that number, they stopped climbing. Because what happened that morning was not just a single event. It was the outcome of a system that had been in place for decades. And that gap, between $11,000 and just $410, is where the story actually begins. To understand it, you have to follow the money from the moment a client writes a check all the way down to the worker crossing the ice. If this is the kind of forensic breakdown you want more of, subscribe to Summit X now. Picture a client writing a check for $50,000 to climb Everest. That number feels large. However, by the time it reaches the Sherpa, who will carry that client's oxygen to 8,000 meters, cross the most dangerous stretch of glaciated terrain on Earth 30 to 40 times, and physically keep that client alive, roughly 8 to 12% of it remains. That gap is where this story lives, around $3,000 to $8,000 for the entire season. Here's how that happens. The Nepal government takes the first cut, collecting $11,000 per climber in permit fees, a figure already legislated to rise to $15,000 in September 2025. In 2024, Everest permits alone generated $4.52 million for the government, which was 77% of Nepal's total national mountaineering permit revenue that year. Not one rupee of that fee is legally earmarked for Sherpa communities, worker compensation funds, or the infrastructure those workers maintain. It goes into general government revenue and stays there. After the permit fee, the expedition agency takes its margin, somewhere between $10,000 and $25,000 depending on the operator. Then come the operating costs, oxygen bottles, camp infrastructure, food, fuel, logistics. On Western-operated expeditions, a lead guide earns $15,000 to $25,000. By the time the budget reaches the Sherpa doing the climbing, load carrying, and rope fixing, the number left is a fraction of what the client originally paid. The sharpest illustration of this is a group of workers almost nobody outside the industry knows by name. Consider what the job actually is. The icefall doctors are hired each spring to build and maintain the route through the Khumbu icefall, a constantly moving glacier between base camp at 5,364 meters and Camp 2 at 6,400 meters. It's a maze of seracs the size of buildings, deep crevasses, and ice that shifts roughly 1 meter every day. The route has to be rebuilt each season. Anchors and ladders need continuous replacement as the glacier moves beneath them. They start in March before any commercial team arrives. They're the last to leave in late May. They make thousands of individual crossings of the most dangerous terrain on Everest. The pay for that job is $2,500 to $3,000 for the season. The icefall doctors are hired and managed by the Sagarmatha Pollution Control Committee, a private environmental body that has held a contract with Nepal's Department of Tourism since 1997. Their funding comes from a flat $600 fee collected per expedition member, entirely separate from the government's $4.52 million permit pool. On a season with 400 climbers, the committee collects $240,000, and the per-worker share works out to the lowest named wage category on the mountain. Since 1953, 48 people have died in the Khumbu icefall. Almost all of them were Sherpas, not clients, the workers who build the road, not the people who use it. Some operators push back on the underpayment argument with a comparison that sounds reasonable on the surface. A Sherpa earning $5,000 for a 3-month season makes roughly 6 to 7 times Nepal's national per capita income of around $640 to $800 per year. By domestic standards, that's significant money. It's one reason families in the Khumbu region depend on this work. But that comparison doesn't answer the right question. The question isn't how Sherpa wages compare to the Nepali average. It's whether the pay is proportionate to the risk and the economic value those workers generate. On that comparison, there is no parity, not even close. The wage gap would matter less if the danger were distributed equally between the people paying for the mountain and the people maintaining it. It isn't. Not by any measurable margin. To understand the scale of what Sherpas actually face on that mountain, start with one number. Over a 10-year period ending in 2014, Sherpa high-altitude workers on Everest died at a rate of 4,035 per 100,000 full-time equivalent workers per year. Commercial fishermen have historically held the title of most dangerous profession at approximately 124 per 100,000. Sherpas died at roughly 32 times that rate during that period. The comparison isn't close. It isn't even the same category of risk. The reason comes down to exposure. A foreign climber traverses the Khumbu icefall 4 to 6 times total during acclimatization rotations, then once more on the summit push. A Sherpa supporting that same client crosses it 30 to 40 times. The icefall doctors cross it hundreds of times per season. Every camp above base camp needs oxygen, food, fuel, rope, tents, and sleeping bags. None of that moves itself. Sherpas carry it, multiple loads per day, multiple days per week, through the same shifting maze of unstable seracs that has killed 48 people since 1953. The client transits the icefall, the Sherpa inhabits it. Now add the biology. To understand why operators keep sending Sherpas into that terrain ahead of everyone else, you have to understand what their bodies can actually do. The Sherpa people carry genetic adaptations to high altitude developed over generations of life, at 3,000 to 4,500 meters. Specific gene variants affect hemoglobin production and oxygen utilization in ways that let Sherpas perform physical labor at altitudes where other humans struggle to walk in a straight line. Most lowland climbers acclimatize over weeks and still function at a fraction of sea level capacity above 7,000 meters. Sherpas don't just tolerate that environment, they work efficiently inside it. This isn't acclimatization, it's a structural biological difference. And it's precisely what makes Sherpa workers irreplaceable to the commercial climbing industry. It's also what makes them the ones sent into the highest hazard zones first, most often, and for the lowest pay. Veteran mountaineer Mark Marshall put the economic reality plainly in an interview with Explorer's Web. Without the money, he said, Sherpas would have no interest in climbing. They're making a living while clients are having a good time, and no amount of money is enough to justify what they're asked to do. That observation matters because it cuts against the idea that Sherpa workers are drawn to the mountain by the same motivations as the clients who hire them. This isn't adventure. It's labor performed under economic pressure by workers who often have few comparable alternatives. The industry runs on a steep pyramid. At the top, elite Sherpas with 10 or more summits can negotiate better pay, better roles, and some leverage over their assignments. A small number earn $8,000 to $15,000 per season when tips and bonuses are included. But most workers aren't at the top of that pyramid. They're at the bottom, in the roles with the highest frequency of hazard exposure and the lowest pay. Younger Sherpas disproportionately fill the load-carrying positions in the icefall because they need the income and don't yet have the reputation to negotiate their way into safer assignments. The experience required to avoid the most dangerous work is only earned by surviving it first. April 18, 2014, made all of this impossible to ignore. At 6:45 in the morning on April 18, 2014, a serac broke loose from Everest's west shoulder and collapsed into the Khumbu icefall. The ice avalanche killed 16 Sherpas. 13 bodies were recovered. 3 remain buried permanently under the glacier. No foreign clients were in the icefall at the time. The victims were load carriers, moving gear to upper camps in the early morning hours before the paying teams began their day. It remains the single deadliest incident in Everest's history. Nepal's government moved quickly. Within days, officials announced a compensation payment to each victim's family. The amount was 40,000 rupees per household, approximately $410. That was the initial offer. It was also the number that ended the season. The Sherpas who died had been earning roughly $125 per day on the mountain. A worker bringing home $5,000 per season would need 12 seasons of work to generate $60,000. the kind of economic replacement a family losing its primary earner actually needed. The government's offer covered less than 4 days of what the dead men had been earning. The mountain had generated roughly $15 million in economic activity that season. The workers who made that season possible received $410 each. On April 22nd, 4 days after the avalanche, 300 Sherpas gathered at Everest Base Camp. They voted by a 2/3 majority to stop all climbing for the remainder of the 2014 spring season. This wasn't a negotiating tactic. It was an act of mourning and collective refusal. Millions of dollars in expedition fees were lost. It was the first labor action of this scale in the entire history of Himalayan mountaineering. Along with the shutdown vote, the Sherpas delivered a written manifesto to the Nepali government. The demands weren't aggressive, they were a floor. Minimum death payout raised to $20,000, up from the existing $5,500. Accepted partially. The government raised the insurance minimum to approximately $10,000, double the previous amount, but still half of what the Sherpas had asked for. An education fund for children of workers who died on the mountain, accepted. The fund was established and a memorial was built. Compensation for Sherpas permanently disabled by injuries on the mountain, which had previously been zero, denied. Guaranteed pay for workers during seasons canceled through no fault of their own, denied. The two demands that would have created the most durable structural protection for living, injured workers were the two the government declined. The pattern was consistent. Acknowledge the dead, ignore the structural conditions that kept producing them. As of 2025, the mandatory minimum insurance payout sits at 2 million rupees, approximately $14,400. That figure came out of the post-2014 negotiations, double the previous $5,500 minimum, but still half of what the Sherpas had demanded. It sounds meaningful until you calculate what it actually covers. A climbing Sherpa who dies at 35 had roughly 30 years of earning capacity remaining. At a conservative $5,000 per year, that's $150,000 in lost lifetime earnings. The $14,400 payout covers less than 10% of that number. For a Sherpa who had been building toward better pay and senior roles, the shortfall is larger still. The disability gap remains worse, because there is still no statutory compensation for workers permanently injured on the mountain and unable to climb again. In 2023, another ice tower collapsed in the Khumbu icefall. 3 Sherpas died. They were carrying loads for clients. The section of the mountain was the same. The workers' role was identical to 2014. 9 years of regulatory reform had not changed the fundamental configuration of who crosses the most dangerous terrain, how often, and what happens to their families when the ice falls. The 2014 strike exposed the system. Budget operators are what keep it running. The commercial Everest market has split into 2 distinct tiers, and the gap between them is measurable in bodies. Premium operators, companies like Alpine Ascents, Adventure Consultants, and Alpenglow, charge between $65,000 and $100,000 per client. They maintain high Sherpa-to-client ratios, fund guide training, supply abundant oxygen including descent reserves, and set hard limits on client numbers, typically no more than 10 per expedition. Budget operators charge $30,000 to $40,000. After the government collects its $11,000 permit fee, that leaves $24,000 to cover all expedition costs and still generate a margin. Something has to give. In practice, several things do. Fewer Sherpas per client, less oxygen, less experienced guides, thinner insurance, and lower wages across the board. The 2017 case of Song Sherpa is a forensic reconstruction of exactly what budget pressure produces at the decision level. Song was 19 on his second Everest season. A high-volume Nepali operator assigned him to guide an older, less experienced Pakistani client on a summit push. The assignment met the regulatory requirement of 1 guide per 2 clients. It satisfied the paperwork. At altitude, when conditions turned dangerous near the summit, neither Sanj nor his client could descend safely. Experienced Sherpas from a separate expedition, a premium operator, performed the rescue. Their staff absorbed the physical risk of an emergency they had no role in creating. Sanj survived, but lost all his fingers to frostbite and can no longer perform technical climbing work. The operator that made the original assignment bore no statutory compensation obligation beyond the wages already paid for the season. Trace the decision chain. The operator reduced guide costs by deploying an inexperienced worker. The regulatory framework permitted it. The rescue cost was externalized to a competitor. The permanent injury cost was externalized to Sanj. Every step followed logically from the budget structure. That dynamic, where budget operators generate the risk and premium operators absorb the rescue cost, is structural. It isn't an edge case. Alan Arnett's analysis of Everest fatalities in 2023 and 2024 found that 23 of the 26 deaths in those 2 seasons occurred on expeditions operating at or below the median price point. That is not coincidence. It is the arithmetic of cost-cutting made visible in mortality data. The pressure this creates on individual Sherpas is specific and traceable. When a worker earns less per season, each summit bonus and client tip becomes a larger proportion of total income. Turning a client around, even when conditions clearly demand it, means losing that bonus, likely losing the tip, and potentially losing a recommendation that affects future employment. Arnett documented this directly, noting that Sherpas and guides face implicit guilt pressure against calling a turnaround even when the mountain is telling them to. That pressure is an economic product. It comes from underpayment. Nepal has attempted regulatory fixes. Permit fees went up. Mandatory insurance minimums were raised. A guide requirement was introduced for all climbers attempting 8,000-meter peaks, set at 1 guide per 2 clients. But the guide regulation carries no training specification, no certification standard, and no minimum experience requirement. An operator that promoted a 19-year-old on his 2nd season would satisfy the rule entirely. The permit fee increase sends more money to the government, none of it earmarked for Sherpa workers or their communities. The insurance minimum, now $14,400, remains below 10% of a working Sherpa's lifetime earning capacity. The regulations shift numbers without changing the structure underneath them. The mountain generates tens of millions of dollars per year. The workers who fix every rope, carry every load, and set every camp earn a fraction of it. When operators compete on price, Sherpa wages are the most flexible line item, so they're the first thing cut. And when the margins get thin enough, the people absorbing that pressure are the ones crossing the icefall 30 times a season, not the ones who paid $50,000 to cross it 4. By September 2025, a foreign client's Everest permit costs $15,000. The government's compensation offer for each of the 16 men who died in the Khumbu icefall in 2014 was $410. Those 2 numbers sit at opposite ends of the same financial structure, and in the 11 years between them, the structure hasn't changed. Permit revenue went up, insurance minimums went up, the regulations multiplied. The icefall doctors still earn $2,500 to $3,000 for a season of work that has killed 48 people since 1953. If you follow Himalayan expeditions or plan to support one, the questions worth asking aren't about the summit rate or the operator's marketing copy. Ask for the Sherpa to client ratio. Ask whether the operator publishes its insurance minimums for high-altitude workers. Ask whether guides are certified or simply old enough to meet a headcount rule. Operators that answer those questions openly are a different category from those that don't. The mortality data confirms that. 2023 was the deadliest season in Everest's recorded history. 23 of those 26 deaths occurred on expeditions at or below the median price. The arithmetic doesn't lie. Subscribe to Summit X and drop a comment below telling us which mountaineering disaster or technical failure you want analyzed next. That's what shapes what gets made here.